our next speaker, Professor Doolittle, whose research approach is interdisciplinary, combining perspectives from anthropology, environmental history, and political ecology to explore environmental histories and the role of political and social inequalities in shaping conflicts over resource use. She has past research in Malaysia and Borneo focused on understanding how British colonists treated native peoples and defined native customary land rights in the late 19th century, and exploring the subsequent influence of this history on contemporary conflicts. Her current research projects focus on understanding indigenous peoples' reactions to the environmental injustice resulting from climate change, and secondly, exploring the environmental history of New Haven, Connecticut, focusing on how the competing narratives of sanitary reform and the City Beautiful movement shaped the urban landscape. Professor Doolittle.
Well, I feel like we have a theme. I think we should have been talking to each other beforehand. But anyhow, I want to thank the students from the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies who chose me for this honor. It is indeed tremendous. Central to my work as a social scientist is listening to people's stories. I celebrate and seek out a diversity of stories that grow in the shadows behind those big stories that dominate our headlines. But I also want to make sure that I understand the roots of power in those dominant headline-grabbing stories. It's these meta-narratives, often the unquestioned beliefs, that hold the power to not only make our world appear intelligible, but to also determine what parts of our world should remain invisible. I want to make sure that the alternative stories, the quiet stories, differing perspectives always remain part of the larger conversation, that they do not become invisible. So in short, stories matter. Many stories matter, and in fact, contradictory stories matter. So in trying to understand the multiplicity of stories that we encounter daily, it's important to recognize that stories have a social function. We tell them to build community, to persuade others, to justify our actions. I want to take a few examples from my research to illustrate how stories, very compelling stories, but competing opposite stories about the environment are told. Ones that are even based in the scientific fact of the time. But I want to point out that they're actually rooted in larger political context, and they're told not solely in the name of advancing science, but in the name of advancing specific and political agendas. In short, science is not always neutral, and everything we do is political, and we need to be explicit and understand that. My first story is about the British colonial treatment of natives and their agricultural practices in North Borneo in the 19th century. I spent many years exploring the Colonial Archives, and consistently the British described native agriculture as primitive, as destroying nature, and their own as scientific, as taming nature. Here's a quote from one of the governors in 1890, lamenting the valuable timber trees that were lost. He said, "By the most destructive mode of cultivation practiced by squatters from Borneo who are allowed to destroy the forest for a crop or two of rice under such primitive methods of agriculture only known to the natives." A similar sentiment was expressed in 1914 by the chief forestry officer, who described native agriculture as the greatest evil to which the forest officer has to contend. And the less civilized and developed the country is, the harder it becomes to keep the annual destruction within bounds. Yet when referring to their own practices, the British colonials had a very different understanding of agriculture. In 1920, a tobacco planter wrote the following in his journal: "There is only one sight more inspiring than the great jungle giant crashing to the ground, and that is a block of jungle burning when it has been felled and stacked. The smoke curling heaven high veils the rising sun and makes it glow a dull, rich red, as in London on a foggy November morning. When all is over, the planter surveys the scene and feels content. He has tamed the untamable." Went on to say it was undoubtedly the most scientific form of planting in the East. Now, how could the colonials persist in telling these stories, vilifying native agriculture and valorizing their own? It's not because these systems were so very different. In fact, some noticed the similarities. Native people, like the tobacco planter, use the land for a year, and then leave it for 10 years. Fears have been expressed as to the bad effects tobacco planting would have in using up the country, as only one crop is taken and fresh land is therefore opened every year. Note, the stories that the British told, making natives the scapegoats for forest destruction and ascribing a much higher value to their own use of resources, drew its logic not from the empirical facts, but rather from dominant ideologies central to the justification of colonial expansion. These are namely social Darwinism, the notion that the British were the most intellectually and technologically advanced civilization in the entire world. They knew how to manage resources better than natives in their own country. And furthermore, they were producing a profit. The British made money from their use of the forest and agriculture. Natives were simply subsisting. Commerce and productivity warranted destruction of forests. Subsistence was just lazy and wasteful. The stories the British told were central to justifying their expansion, but they masked the agenda of imperialism and resource extraction in this neutral language of science and rationality. So my next example is much closer to home. It's from New Haven, looking at the archives in New Haven, trying to understand our environmental history. As I was reading through the archives, Beaver Ponds is an area that quickly jumped out to me and grabbed my attention, in part because people just spent so much time writing about it, but also wildly different descriptions of the area. In 1890, this was one description. The bog, filthy and foul beyond descriptions, a rich green scum, double distilled nastiness covers the lifeless waters, the tangled underbrush and rank weeds that infest the bank. One can almost see the odors leaping heavenward, and the air seems to be alive with noiseless, grinning demons of disease, hissing out hot volumes of seething, death-dealing pestilence, a veritable paradise lost. Now, this narrative is rooted in the miasma theory of infection that was dominant in the time. It was a scientific theory that was put forth during the sanitary reform movement in the US, hypothesizing that rotting organic waste was the source of all the epidemics, the yellow fever and the smallpox. So here's a few more select quotes. Hell's Alley, death lurks in every corner. Infamous and legendary place where murder is not unusual among the Polish squatters living in shanties. So I want to dwell on this last one for a moment. It's linking marginal environments with marginal people. Throughout the US at this time, there was a growing fear that immigrants and their unsanitary practices were the source of our diseases, of our problems. Sounds familiar. Sanitary reformers were quick to condemn immigrants and the environments in which they lived. So rather than invest resources in infrastructure or developing policies that would address inadequate living conditions, they would rather just condemn them. Here's a few images to give you an idea of the depth of our national concern about immigrants. 1882, this illustration shows malaria, smallpox, and leprosy emanating from Chinatown. 1896, Uncle Sam is rejecting immigrants, or at least turning up his nose, based on the baggage they carry: religion, poverty, anarchy, and disease. 40 years later, Franklin Olmsted, the son of a renowned landscape architect who created Central Park, saw Beaver Ponds very different. He saw picturesque lakes and islands, verdant uplands and wooded banks, graceful, pleasing areas which can be preserved. This period of time, 1920, was characterized by the City Beautiful movement. Social theories advocated for well-planned parks to cure the moral corruptions of the immigrant class that were still amassing in our urban centers. Now, did the landscape change? Not at all. I've read every single word written about Beaver Ponds in this time period. The landscape didn't change, the story changed. In both eras, the stories were presented as facts, backed by science, the theories of the time, miasma theory of disease, or social reformers' belief of the restorative powers of nature. But in both eras, these stories supported a different political agenda. Namely, how can we control the urban landscape and the immigrants? How can we rationalize space and people? So I want to leave you with two thoughts. One, question ideas that we take as fact. When confronted with what seems like an incontrovertible truth, ask yourself, what is the work of this story? Are there contradictory experiences? Are there different bodies of evidence that would undermine the story? And remember, if we're listening to a single story, the chances are we're hearing only from those in power. We need to embrace multiple stories and ask what systems of power will tumble if I listen to a different story? What new truths will become visible if I embrace a different perspective? As both examples from my research show, and I have many more if you have many more hours, stories considered as science and reason in one period of time can be seen as myth and irrationality in another period of time. So my last point is to emphasize that there is power in your story. Both in our scholarship and in our interpersonal relations, we must listen to a diversity of stories. By sharing stories, we learn who we are, we learn what we believe in. We know, science tells us, that diverse teams of communities that can learn to communicate across differences are far more successful at solving complex problems. In other words, a diversity of opinions, a diversity of what we consider as valid evidence matters. We must be willing to share stories and to listen to each other, with the knowledge that if we suppress some opinions, if we suppress particular voices for the fear that it doesn't fit with expected norms, we collectively become less empathetic, less effective at solving problems, and less creative. We need to hear and value many different stories.